Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. This is our second to the last video lecture, right? So after this lecture, I will have one more lecture um, about the last short story reading for our class, right? Conan's Wake by Gina Apostol, and yeah, and then that will be the last lecture video. And then next week, obviously, is finals week. All right, so just a couple of announcements um, before I start the lecture. Um, so as you know, right, 10% of your grade is participation, right, and that participation, um, I initially said that you can get that 10% by doing a Zoom meeting with me, right? That's still true, half true, right? So the way that I'm going to grade that 10% is that 5% I will give to you. Well, everyone will just get 5%, right? Because I was initially going to give it to people who contacted me through email, right? But you've all sort of contacted me through email, your submission, your responses, and stuff like that. So everyone will just get an automatic 5% of participation, right? And then the remaining 5%, right, is through Zoom meeting, right? So if you want that extra 5%, right, schedule a Zoom meeting with me if you haven't already. Um, and yeah, and it doesn't matter what we talk about or whatever, right? As long as you do a Zoom meeting with me, you'll get that 5%, right? And if you decide to just not do that and let go of the 5%, that's fine too, right? Um, Okay, and for your responses, right? I know on the first response, I emailed everyone, right? That I received your response, but then the second response, I didn't email everybody, right? And so some kind of asked me if I received it or not. And so just for your peace of mind, right? Sometime next week, I will email like those who did not give me a response paper, right? I will email them maybe Monday next week, right? I will email those who missed any of the responses and just make sure that um, I did not miss it, right? Or give you a chance to do it if you still want to do it, right? Yeah, so that's for the response papers. And then my plan for this week is Friday I will give you the prompt um, for the second essay, right? And and then by Monday I will give you back your first essay with comments and grade, right? So that's Monday next week, right? And then the second paper will be due. I have to check when my grades are going to be due, but so the final paper will be due either Friday or Saturday next week, right? I will let you know as soon as I find out, right? Because I don't know when my grade is due yet, and then that will, yeah, I'll have to kind of plan how much time I need to grade and then submit my grades, right? Um, so, but it will be either Friday or Saturday next week that the second paper will be due, right? Okay, and then lastly, I am just canceling the final exam, right? I don't really do final exams. I just write it because we kind of have to, but I don't I don't see a point in final exams. You already have to write a long paper for the class, right? An essay, and that's enough work, right? So I'm just canceling the final exam. Everyone will get an A. for that portion of your grade, right? So just focus your time um, on writing your paper, right? The second paper, and then obviously the fourth and final response paper is still due Sunday, right? All right, so let's just jump right into um, today's lecture. So today I will be talking about, so the readings for today are pages 293 to 318 of your Arguing About Literature book, right? And then also I assigned um, another reading, the chapter 8 of Stanley Fish's How to Write a Sentence, right? So um, this is the book, and there's a PDF copy that I provided for you in course materials. So check that out. Just read chapter 8, right? And so I'll also talk a little bit about that for this lecture, right? And so this portion of the book, right, talks about literary criticism, right? And literary criticism is, it's hard to explain it in a very brief description, but obviously literary means something related to literature, right? So we already talked about, you know, what encompasses literature, right? It can go from poetry and novels to letters um, to memes, right? Um, to whatever, right? So so anything related to literature, right? And then criticism, right? Is it means, you know, we're interpreting literature, right? We're uh, critically interpreting literature, right? So what you were doing in your first paper, right? That is literary criticism, right? You're already performing literary criticism by interpreting, um, by sort of um, doing close readings, right? That you are already doing literary criticism, right? And what criticism just means, right, is just, you know, we're using literature to question, to rethink, to break apart, right? Uh, Preconceived notions about anything, about any theme, right? That we see in stories, right? We interpret it. We question it. We sort of um, we sort of we recreate the meaning of things, right? And you know, we take sort of what it usually means on the surface, right, and then dig deeper into saying that, oh, this is what it means on the surface, but this is actually what it means underneath the surface, right? So that sort of process, right, interacting, engaging with literature in a critical way, that in itself, right, is literary criticism, right? But you know, for the sake of because literature, there are different kinds of literature, right? And then there are different themes, different, you know, different stories, and you know, different sort of subjects in literature. Literary criticism has been sort of divided, right, into different schools, right? So different sort of areas of criticism, and we refer to it as schools, right, of criticism, right? And these different schools of criticism, right, they have their own sort of priorities, right? different priorities that they focus on, and that's what they use as a lens for interpreting literature, right? And so, for example, feminist criticism, right? They are interested in sort of, equal rights for women, right? Equal representation of women, right? And also kind of like breaking down preconceived notions about women, right, and their role in society, right? And so the feminist critic, right, would be looking at how women are sort of portrayed in literature, right, and say if that's sort of like a bad representation, a good representation, or how might we sort of rethink the way we see women in society, right? So that is one school of criticism, right? So there's feminist criticism, there's Marxist feminism, psychoanalytic, queer, um, critical race theory, right? Post-colonialism. So all of these things, of all these schools, right? We're going to go through one by one today to kind of to talk about, right? Um, and take, for example, right, the sample essay that we talked about in my previous lecture um, about Jamaica Kincaid's story Girl, right, and how the author of the essay sort of argued that the mother's tone, right, towards the girl, right, towards her daughter, on the surface seems, right, like um, it seems like it's empowering, right, the girl, um, but what it's actually doing, right, is um, it's disempowering the girl, right? So we have two different sort of interpretations of what the women in Girl are sort of doing, right? And different ways that they sort of empower and disempower sort of the other, right? And that's an example of a feminist critique, right? Obviously, the paper did not say that, oh, this is a feminist critique, right? Blah blah blah, but what the paper is actually doing, right, is sort of looking at the role of women in society, right, and how that role gets passed on, right, and so that in itself is a feminist criticism, right. And so for the second essay, right, for your second assignment essay, um, I will ask, so you will still do the same thing, right? The same structure of your paper, the same sort of introduction, body paragraph, body paragraphs, and then conclusion, right? And then um, your thesis will still be, towards the end of your introduction, right? So you'll still do the same thing, right? You'll still do interpretation. You'll still pick a theme. You'll still do close readings. You'll still be quoting from the um, from from whatever you choose, right? The only thing is that I want you to choose one of the schools of criticism, right? And then engage with that in your paper, right? And then I also require you at least one outside academic source, right? And that source will be sort of um, so that source should be about the school of criticism, right? That you are using, right? So if you choose, for example, a temporary matter. So this is another thing, right? And so for your second paper, you can write about any story from first week up until the last week, as long as you didn't use that for your first essay, right? So you can, if you wrote about Flannery O'Connor's Everything That Rises Must Converge for your first paper. Um, then you want to write about a temporary matter for your second paper, that's perfectly fine, right? You're not limited to Sonny's Blues or Kunanan's Wake, right? So you can write about any story as long as you haven't written about it yet in your first paper, right? So yeah. So for example, right? For example, you choose A Temporary Matter by Jhumpa Lahiri, right? You choose to write about that for your second paper, and you choose a sort of a feminist critique or a feminist approach, right, into your paper, right? You might want to argue that Shobha, right? You know how in the beginning, in the past, she was a typical sort of domestic woman, sort of wife, right? Who did everything well at home, very organized and great homemaker, and then she got married. She got pregnant, right? And so she was all doing all of the right things, right? All the right things. By that I mean like all the sort of like the right ways of being a woman, right? Um, in American, but also in Indian culture, right? Um, but then something went wrong, right, in the middle, and then that sort of changed her view about herself and about her role as a woman, right? And then she does this very sort of unpredictable thing of like uh, leaving her husband, right? Which seems out of character, right, for someone like her who sort of just followed social norms most of her life, right? So in many ways, you can argue that Shobha's action, right, is precisely the effect, right? It's her sort of way of disconnecting, right, from her sort of um, socially constructed role as a woman, right? And so you can argue that Jhumpa Lahiri, right, is giving Shobha's character agency and the ability to choose and the ability to sort of, act as she wishes, right? And so that could be right. And so if you decide to do that, right, you'll want to look for an article, right, about feminist criticism. It has to be a scholarly article, right? And then you will sort of read the article and find ways to sort of incorporate that in your paper, right? Especially, key terms from your source, right, that you might be able to use, right, to um, to your paper, right? And I will also be providing you some articles that you can use if you want to, right? But you can also do your own research if you want. Okay, so let's just go through the the 8 different schools of criticism, right? So this is I'm starting on page 294, right, of your Arguing About Literature book. Right, so the first school of criticism is new criticism, right? And I will just read this passage from the book, right? Sometimes called close reading, this approach does not see either the writer's intention or the reader's personal response as relevant, right? It is also uninterested in the text's social context, the spirit of the age, or its relevance to issues of gender, social justice, or oppression, right? These critics are interested, for example, um, in a poem's internal structure, images, symbols, metaphors, point of view, plot, and characterizations, right? Emphasis is placed on literary language, and the ways connotation, ambiguity, irony, and paradox all reinforce the meaning. In fact, how a poem means is inseparable from what it means, right? Um, and so this is so new criticism, right? It's a way of reading that takes away sort of outside sort of influences, right? The readers, the sort of like social context or whatever, right? It focuses on just language, right? And the way sort of like words are put together. So it focuses on sort of grammatical structure. It focuses on um, syntax, right? So syntax is the combination of words, right, to create phrases that are effective, right? Um, and so that's sort of, or it focuses on specific um, symbolism, I guess, and specific kind of like the style, right? It focuses on the style of of the text, right? And so, for example, um, you take Sunny's Blues, right? And you're interested in the issue of sound, right, in Sunny's Blues because it talks a lot about sound, right, and jazz, right? If you're interested in sound, then you can kind of think about how Baldwin sort of creates the descriptions, how he writes the descriptions, and how he writes the dialogues, right? Is there a particular sound to it that sort of that reinforces the idea of sound and music and jazz, right? To be honest, like new criticism is not sort of it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's if you're an English major or you are very you're very much interested in grammar and grammatical structures and syntax, this is probably the school for you. But yeah, you have to sort of like really understand the structures of language, right, in order to do this effectively, right? And so if you decide to do that, I encourage you to maybe talk to me and sort of, um, have a conversation with me so I can kind of guide you through it, right? So that's neo-criticism, right? And then the second one is feminist criticism, right? I already kind of mentioned feminist criticism, um, and yeah, so like how I talked about Shoba and in a contemporary matter, and how you could read, right, Shoba's character through a feminist lens, right, and how her character sort of shifted, right, from sort of domestic to um, just sort of leaving, right, the domestic. So the domestic space obviously is the home, right, but then we end with a sort of a leaving the domestic space, right. Um, so that could be one way um, to um, to to interpret, right, Shoba's character through a feminist lens, right. And then here we have um, where are we at? Psychoanalytic criticism, right. So psychoanalytic criticism, let's just read this passage since it's very short. Psychoanalytic criticism began with Sigmund Freud, right? He's the founder of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious, right? So the unconscious is sort of the part in our brain, right, that we sort of don't have a control over, right? And so this could be sort of dreams, for example, right, or what's called the Freudian slip, right? When you say something that you accidentally say something that you purposely don't want to say, but then your mouth just kind of like slips and says it, right? They call that a Freudian slip, right? So there's sort of like there's memory, right, stored in our brains in the unconscious, right? That sometimes we don't have control over, right? But it kind of controls us, right? Right. So theories of the unconscious, especially the numerous repressed wounds, fears, unresolved conflicts, right, and guilty desires and trauma, right, from childhood that can significantly affect behavior and mental health in our adult lives, right? So the way that our sort of psychological health, right, um, is sort of developed from a young age, and how it experienced trauma, how it dealt with specific experiences, right? That somehow sort of influences the way that we think as adults, right? Um, and so Freud developed the tripart division of the mind into the ego, the superego, and the id, right? So the ego is the conscious self, right? Our self that we are, that we know of, right? That we are able to think, right? And then the superego, the site of what our culture has taught us about good and bad, right? So the superego is, how we sort of process the things around us, how we're influenced by other people, by religion, by certain beliefs, right? By culture, right? And how we sort of integrate that into our way of thinking, right? And then the id, right? The primitive unconscious and source of sexual desire, right? So the id is this sort of this sort of like instinct, right? Instinct to sort of this animalistic sort of instinct to live and to reproduce, right? So reproduction equals sex drive, right? So that's sort of how Freud has divided the ways that we sort of that our mind works, right? As having an instinct or the id, right? That's animalistic, and then B, the ego, the way that we perceive ourselves, right? And then the superego, the way that we perceive ourselves based on how we want to be seen, right, by the outside world, right, or how we've been influenced by the outside world, right. And so psychoanalytic critics, right, often see literature as a kind of dream, right, filled with symbolic elements that often mask their real meaning, right. Freud also theorized that young males were threatened by their fathers in the competition for the affection of their mothers. Critics are alert to complex ways this Oedipal drama unfolds in literature, right. Um, so think of Sunny in Sunny's Blues, right? Think of the description, especially when Sunny is sort of in this state of trance, right? Towards the end, when he was performing and playing music, and then there's like a description that's like hallucinatory, right? Well, almost like dreamlike, right? Or trance-like, right? As if he is like high, but also maybe high on heroin, but also maybe just high on music. But there is a sense of the description, right? That's almost like a dream, right? And so you can take that through psychoanalytic lens, right? And sort of make assumptions about what those descriptions are doing, right? Because the idea is that what happens in our dreams, right? Those are products of you know things in our head, right? So that's product of our memory, our experience that maybe we've forgotten about. Yeah. Um, and so, in many ways, right, these dreamlike descriptions, right, we can find traces of our past that might help solve problems, right, or issues, right, that we try to resolve, right. So yeah. So if you want to like look at Sunny's um, the description, right, when he's sort of high on music, um, you can sort of read that through a psychoanalytic lens, right? Okay, so Marxist criticism, right? This is based on um, the philosophy of Karl Marx, right? So I will just read it here. So Marxist criticism is based on the political and economic theories of Karl Marx. Marxists think that a society is propelled by its economy, which is manipulated by a class system. Right. Most people, especially blue-collar workers, the proletariat, do not understand the complex ways their lives are subject to economic forces beyond their control. Right. This false consciousness about history and material well-being prevents workers from seeing that their values have been socially constructed for them in their place. Right. What most interests contemporary Marxists is the way ideology shapes our consciousness. Right. And since literature both represents and projects ideology, Marxist critics see it as a way to unmask our limited view of society's structure. Right. Um, so basically, when you're a Marxist critic, right, you look at uh, you know characters, right, that are often working within the structure of a class system, right, or a capitalist system, like the American sort of capitalist system, right, um, where there is a priority on profit, right, and sort of everyone else is just sort of exploited, right, and made to work and made to produce things, right, so that corporate profit can be maintained and also increased, right. Um, so the main idea, right, is that you know the capitalist system. So Karl Marx is critical of the capitalist system, right? And so the main idea is the capitalist system, right? Sort of does not only exploit um, uh, working people, right? But they actually make working people think that their lives will only be meaningful if they are being productive, right? And if they are only if they are sort of producing um, what can be then used for profit, right? And so, think of America right now and how most people sort of feel, especially during the pandemic, right, where everyone is being unproductive, right? No one is doing anything, and that's a big blow on capitalism, right? Um, and so, yeah, you think about a lot of people, right? They're feeling very sort of empty um, because they can't be productive, right? And they sort of like, because productivity has been so embedded in our lives, right, and in how we sort of think of ourselves and how we create meaning for ourselves, right? Um, and so without work, right, without productivity, we feel like we don't mean anything, right? And that is particularly what capitalism wants you to think, right? So that you're always kind of working, right? And you're always sort of producing something for profit, right? Um, yeah, so if you want to be anti-capitalist for a little bit, just don't do anything, right? Just rest. Um, yeah, so the idea, right? The Marxist critique is looking at how we might be able to change that, right? So that we are sort of exploited less, right? By Because the more we know that we are exploited, right, the more we sort of resist, right, the exploitation, right, and so it's important for capitalism to make the people think, right, that they only mean something if they're being productive, right. Um, and so one example, right, is you see how sort of the brothers in Sonny's Blues, right? The brother, the narrator, is a teacher, successful, right? Has a family. He's not only productive, he's also reproductive, right? Which means that he has sort of he has a family and he has children, right? And that's capitalism wants that too. because more children means more exploitable bodies, right? Um, and so, yeah, think of the brother, and so also Sonny. Sonny is not really productive, right? He is, he loves music, right? And then music is not really, it doesn't really, at that time, like now, music is, music is um, has become has a function in capitalism now, right? Because of there's a lot of money involved in music now, but for Sonny, like doing music and doing jazz, especially at that time, right? There was no money in it. Um, it was not being productive. He was doing it for the sake of just pleasure, right? He just needed to do it, right? While the brother is the typical kind of like contributing to education, contributing to society, this and that, right? So one way of looking at Sonny, right, and the brother, right, is that the brother is functioning within the realm of the capitalist structure, right, while Sonny is actually, by refusing to follow the rules, by refusing to go to school, by refusing to do all the things, right, um, is doing sort of like, and refusing to reproduce, right, is actually doing an anti-capitalist act, right, and the fact that Sonny is the one who sort of who goes to prison, right, you can kind of tell, right, that the legal system does not protect you if you are not sort of contributing to capitalism, right? So capitalism doesn't only work through corporation, right, but it also sort of works in tandem with institutions of the university, the police, the government, right? So there's a lot of things, and then Sonny is sort of the victim, right, who doesn't contribute, and so he suffers the consequences, right? So that's one way, yeah, that you can sort of that you can use Marxist criticism in reading Sonny's Blues, right? And then the next one is deconstruction, right? Deconstruction, I'm going to skip deconstruction because it's too much. It's too much for me. I mean, I can talk about it if you want to, but I think it's and there's really like, I mean, there's always something in the reading, but there's nothing in our reading that's like overtly applies to deconstruction, right? But if you are interested in it for some reason and you want to use it, I suggest just meeting with me through Zoom, and then we can talk more about it, right? It's just, I don't know, it's too complicated for me. Yeah, and then the next one is reader response criticism, right? So here there's an example of how Stanley Fish, right? Stanley Fish wrote How to Write a Sentence, right? And so they're talking about him here and how he's actually an example of a reader response critic, right? Um, so I'm reading the last paragraph of this section. So response critics like Stanley Fish downplay individual responses, focusing instead on how communities influence our responses to texts. We probably all belong to a number of these interpretive communities, such as churches, universities, neighborhood, political parties, social class, and have internalized their interpretive strategies, their discourses, or their way of reading texts of all kinds. Fish's point is that we all come to texts already predisposed to read them in a certain way. We do not interpret stories, but we create them by using the reading tools and cultural assumptions we bring with us. Our reading then reveals what is in us more than what is in the text. We find what we expect to see, right? So as the name right, signifies reader response. This is interested in, so if you remember new criticism, right, new criticism is not interested in you or the social context or whatever, right? It's only interested in the text, what's written and how it's written, right? Reader response is the opposite, right? It's saying that what is written only means something, right, based on how we respond to it, you, the reader, right? And obviously, each reader, we read it based on, our own set of ideologies, right? So, depending on our knowledge about the world, right, or about feminism, whatever, right? Um, that's the kind of lens that we use to interpret whatever we're reading, right? And so if you read Sonny's Blues, right, and you become sort of emotional, right, because because I don't know, maybe you're a person of color and you can relate to issues of systemic racism, or that you are very much embedded, or you are sort of very active perhaps in the Black Lives Matter movement right now, right? And reading Sonny's Blues makes you sort of think about the social and racial context back then, but also right now, right, that we're facing, right? So in many ways, you are using your own knowledge and um, your own ideology, right, in interpreting um, the the text, right? So that is reader response, right? That the text only means something once a reader interprets it, right? You, the reader, you interpret it, right? All right. So the next one is post-colonial criticism, right? And so, as the name also signifies, right, sort of colonial means this is in the context of colonization, right? So that means that one country sort of went to invade and colonize, right, other countries, right? So, for example, I don't know, European countries, colonized a lot of African countries, right? Or France colonizing Vietnam, right? Or America colonizing the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico and Hawaii, right? And Britain at one point, right, was one of um, the largest sort of colonial uh, kingdom in the world. Also Spain, right? Lots of colonies everywhere, right? The Philippines was also a colony of Spain. Portugal was also a big colonial rule, right? At one point. Um, so yeah, so all of this colonial places, right? Places that have been colonized, right? And post, right, obviously means after, right? So um, after colonization, like a lot of these places have been sort of made independent, right? So um, they're freed from the rule of the colonizer, right? So they form their own government and etc. Right? Um, and so, in many ways, right, a lot of the narratives that have been written about these colonial spaces um, were written by the colonizer, right? So, usually written by white colonizers, right? And so, the narratives that we get usually is a narrative of conquest, right? A narrative of triumph, a narrative of spreading freedom, all this kind of like good things, right? That yeah, colonization is good because blah blah blah, right? um, we're there to help people and this and that, right? So that's from the point of view of the white colonizer, right? Um, but obviously, that's not the only story, right? Part of colonialism is destruction and violence and genocide and exploitation and slavery, right? All this bad shit. That's very much, right, the bigger part of colonization. All those good things, I don't know, they're just for show, right? But the violence, right, is usually the bigger part of colonization, right? Um, and so post-colonial sort of criticism, right, sort of thinks about or rethinks, right, this narrative of the white colonizer, right, saying that, yeah, the white colonizer's narrative is saying that this is all good, right, but actually what's happening is this, right? So you're kind of deconstructing, in a way, what the white colonizers are saying, right, and saying that these are the actual truth, right, about colonization, right? And it's usually from the point of view of the colonized, right? And so instead of the white colonizer making the narrative, we then look at the narrative of the colonized, right, and their experience during the colonial rule, right. And so that's sort of the um, the lens, right, that you use in post-colonial criticism is to kind of go back and retrace the history, right, that's been provided for you, right, and rewrite, right, the history, because part of colonization, right, is erasing that history of violence, right, and so those interested in post-colonial critique, right, sort of reproduces, right, that history of violence, right, and I think um, the next story that we're going to talk about, Kunanan's Wake, right, that's written by Gina Apostol, that will be more sort of related to post-colonial criticism, right? And so I will talk about that when I talk about that story in the next video. Okay, so the next one is New Historicism, right? So New Historicism, um, it's a way of rethinking history, right? Because for so many people, right, they look at history and they think that, yeah, this is history and this is exactly what happened, right? Um, but if you think about it, history was written by people who were educated, people who were, in a certain position in society, right, with money, right, with position. They're usually men, right, especially in the European context. They're usually white men, right, who gets educated and um, who gets to write history books, right, and they're usually religious, right, and and so those who write history, right, they have their own sort of ideology wrapped up in how they write the history, right? And so in the past, people used to just say that, oh, this is a history book, so this must be true, right? But now that we know better, right, we now think about the history or history sort of books, right, and say that, I'm going to read this, but I'm not going to read it and assume that it's true, right? But I'm going to be critical in reading this history, right? And so instead of um, history, there's this also term historiography, right? I can't really say that. Historiography. um, so it's the sort of the study of the process of creating history, right? And so instead of just believing history, we go back and think why is this the history that's being told, right? What's missing, right? What other histories are not being told, right? Because obviously those who write history, they can't write about everything, right? And they're also wrapped up in their ideology that they miss a lot of things, right? And so we're now going back to um, to sort of question how history has been written, right? Um, and so, of course, right, especially here in America, usually what gets taught in schools, right, is the history of, America as this country that, you know, um, gives freedom to people, and a country that, um, is great and because it does all of these things, blah, 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 right? A country of immigrants, blah, 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 right? But the dark side of American history, right, that doesn't really get talked about a lot, is that, when Europeans came to America to colonize it, they killed a lot of, indigenous people, Native Americans, right? Um, Genocide, right? And and then they also perpetuated slavery, right, in America. And of course, there was a whole tradition of slavery, and then racism, and all other kinds of violent things. And then there is the expansion of America, right, the colonization of Puerto Rico, Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii, right, and that sort of expansion also. Um, um, it was also violent, very violent, right? The Philippines was the most violent in all sort of American conquest, right? I think up to 500,000 to 1 million Filipinos were killed when the Americans colonized the Philippines. Right. So all of this sort of like dark side of colonization, right, is a history that's not really sort of told, right? Because obviously, you know, America wants to protect itself and its name, right? And so new historicism, right, uses history, right, to interpret stories, right? But then you're also rethinking history, right? So, for example, Sonny's Blues, right? The history of slavery, right, and the history of institutionalized racism in America, right, is a history that's not a part of mainstream American history, right? But then Sonny's Blues is actually what it does is actually providing that context for that history that has been erased, right? Um, and so, as a new historicist critic, right, you can argue that Sonny's Blues is actually not just a story, right, but um, it's a history book, right? It's providing a history of America that is not part of uh, mainstream history, right? So that is new historicism, right? Um, and then last but not the least is queer theory, right? So this is obviously like feminist uh, criticism that is interested in the rights and representation of women, right? Queer theory is interested in, the rights and representation of queer people, which means uh, um, LGBTQ people, right? Um, but more than equality and representation, right? What queer theory is actually more interested in is to question the idea of heterosexuality, right? Because the idea of, and I say the idea, right, because it is an idea, right? Like being straight is an idea, right? Obviously, sexuality and desire is more fluid than just, you know, than just being straight, right? Um, and so, but then, you know, ideologically, right, heterosexuality has been made to become normal, right, and has been made to be the sort of the superior sort of sexuality, right, and the superior gender, right, masculinity specifically, right, and so by creating, right, by closing this idea of the heterosexual, right, those who do not fit in this box of the heterosexual gets pushed out, right, because their desires are not, they don't fit the norm, right. Those who are attracted to men, men who are attracted to men, women who are attracted to women, men who are attracted to both genders, right, or trans people, right, who feel like they are been sort of assigned in the wrong body, right, or those who feel like the gender binary of male female um, is not fitting for them, right, and so they identify as non-binary people, right, and so all of these sort of people who have been othered, right, because of the creation of the idea of um, heterosexuality, right. These are sort of like the subject of queer theory, right. And so the main points is to criticize heterosexuality, right. So what sort of like led society, right, to create this idea of the heterosexual, right, and the straight man, right, or straight woman, right? What is it that led to sort of creating this sort of like pure um, sexuality, right? And um, and so criticizing heterosexuality, right? But then also, how can we learn, right? From like what can we learn from queer people, right? And their ways of sort of dealing with sexuality. Um, what can sort of heterosexuality learn from that, right? Because obviously um, heterosexuality is a deprived group, right? Those who are considered heterosexual or who have considered themselves as heterosexual, right? They have sort of, um, I guess they have um, delusionally, right? delusionally um, cleanse themselves, right, of other ways of thinking about sexuality, right? By saying that, oh, this is just who I am. I'm just straight, right? And so, and so, questioning that and thinking about what queerness plays, right? What role queerness plays in criticizing the idea of the heterosexual, right? And so that's what um, um, queer theory does, right? And if you think about Sunny's Blues, right, Sunny is not explicitly gay, right? But you can also argue that, and of course, you know, there is a historic or there is a biographical context to this because James Baldwin himself is gay or was gay, right? And so, and I feel like Sunny has some. I'm not saying that characters should always be compared to the writer, right? But I feel like there is a connection between Sunny and James Baldwin, right? And so, you know, even though Sunny is not explicitly gay, he has qualities that is other, right? Other than his brother, who is kind of stereotypically heterosexual, right? So typical, teacher, married, kids, right? Sort of, so typical heterosexual, and then Sunny is the other, right? Um, and so in many ways, right? And he's sort of like, he likes music, and this sort of like not typically heterosexual um, sort of pursuit, right? Um, and so so how might we read Sunny's queerness, right, or otherness against the brother who is sort of stereotypically heterosexual, right? So that's one way, right, that you can sort of use queer theory, right? Um, and so so start thinking about first, of course, like choose a story, right, that you want to write about, and then start thinking about one of these schools of criticism that you're interested in using to interpret your story, right? And I will be, in the next couple of days, I will be providing you with articles and um, maybe, articles about these, like more information about these schools of criticism. Um, and the articles that I give you, you can use those. Uh, you can use those to as your outside source, right? So the articles that I'll be giving you, they're scholarly articles, right? And you can just use that for your outside research, right? So yeah, I think that's it for this video, and um, feel free to email me or meet with me if you have any more questions.